Well, today we have the pleasure of hearing from Naomi Nye, our author in residence, sponsored by the Northrop and Blake classes of 1955 in their speaker fund. Naomi has been, yes, for the class of 55, represented here, and their children. Mr. Adams, thanks for being here. Naomi has been in the classroom in our various campuses this week discussing her poetry, essays, novels, etc. with the Blake students. And tonight she's going to head home to San Antonio to be reunited with her husband Michael and their son Madison, who's back in town as a school teacher. And now, let me tell you that veteran journalist Bill Moyers, who we all know, says Naomi is just a remarkable voice in our time. And he certainly is not alone in his assessment that she has more awards than all 30 of her books have dust covers to list them all. I won't go through them all today, but trust me, when you pick up the books, you'll be amazed at what she has achieved. Naomi describes herself as a wandering poet, as she has spent most of her life traveling across the U.S. and across the entire globe. I wonder if her desire to be on the road isn't because she shares her birthday with Jack Kerouac. Yet despite all her travels to the far-flung corners of the world, Naomi called one of her collections of short stories, "There Is No Long Distance Now." And I had the pleasure of reading it in some of her other books. And just to give you a glimpse of what she writes about, let me read from the dust cover of this book. In these 40 life-altering, life-affirming, and extremely short stories, the award-winning poet Naomi Nye proposes that no matter how great the divide between friends, siblings, life and death, classmates, enemies, happiness and misery, war and peace, breakfast and lunch, parent and child, country and city, there is in fact no longer distance, not anymore. So here to talk to us about her writing, her travel, and life experiences is Naomi Nye.
Nice introduction. What an elegant and gracious introduction so early in the morning. I'm grateful to Woody Kingman, and I'm grateful to all of you for coming to be together here in this beautiful room where I do feel more exalted than I usually feel at this time of day. I want to wish a very happy birthday to our friend here, Alan Burdick. Happy birthday. Bravo to you. It's a great honor to be with people on their birthdays, and my special thanks to Sarah and Beth for coordinating this elegant breakfast in this room. I'm extremely impressed by the Blake School food service, which the students are too and the teachers are too. It's been so much fun to be at the school. But I'm mostly impressed by the spirit of education that goes on here. All of you have some connection or another with Blake School, and I feel very, very lucky in my wanderings when I enter into a community of learning that feels the way this place feels. It's very hard to be downcast very long about, quote, the state of education when you have a place like Blake School in your mind. The students have been generous, they've been funny, they've been inquisitive. I was about 5:15 a.m. this morning answering further questions from the second grade, which I mailed back to them. I mean, beyond the many questions they asked in their room, they had created a packet of questions. Yesterday, I fell in love with a poem in this very hall by Mr. Sam Shapiro, grade 7, and I asked his permission to read it last night and at my reading, and I think it may have been the most popular thing I read in the entire reading. So I love it so much that I want to read it to you this morning, and also I think he should send it to Garrison Keillor immediately. It's called A Poem by Sam Shapiro, grade 7. Talk to your poem. Ask it how everything is. See if it wants a drink. You know, it's not so easy being a poem. A poem needs to be up bright and early for the early readers, and a poem has to stay up late for a late reader. A poem needs to flow like a boat on the ocean. A poem needs an author, but without a reader, a poem is dead, drooping like a flower. This poem's hero is you. Isn't that great? Go Sam, so great. So also I'm carrying with me just a few other items I will show. When I was leaving over at the Highcroft campus, I think it was a third grade class, someone named Ryan just stuck, I love when you're a poet, people just stick poems into your pockets as you leave their rooms. And I found this later. Fear is a choice. It does not matter if you climb the highest cliff or swim the deepest sea. I'm going to keep this with me. And also an art class over at Highcroft created in approximately 15, 20 minutes, not only a poem about the wave, the famous Japanese print of the wave, but they created a book and they illustrated it and gave it to me, which to me makes a fine testimonial that sometimes we think that these things can't be happening all around us every day. They know they can. So this was exciting to have them send the book to me in another class. Being in Minnesota has always been inspiring to me because you have such a great literary history here. I read the works of Robert Bly when I was an 18-year-old in college in Texas and fell in love with his poems, fell in love with the translations he was doing of many writers from different countries. Last night there was a special presentation here at the American Swedish Institute of the new collection called Airmail, the letters of Robert Bly and Thomas Tranströmer, the great Swedish poet who won the Nobel Prize for Literature last year. Thank goodness, finally he won it. But this is a terrific book. I started it last night, so excited to have it in hand, printed by Grey Wolf Press here in Minneapolis, and also they've reprinted now a collected edition of Thomas Tranströmer, translated and collected by Robert Bly, The Half-Finished Heaven. I've had this other book here, Minnesota Writes Poetry, with me since 1996. This is a fantastic book from Milkweed Editions. And one thing I like to say to students in Minnesota is how close I feel to this state because I've read these voices. I feel I know the history, the ancestors, some of the customs, some of the traditions, a little bit more about the winter, which feels very exotic to someone living in South Texas. But because you read, because we all read, we get to have much larger lives, which is the gift that I was given as a child, going to the library, having teachers who were passionate about reading, writing, memorizing, sharing work. I was very lucky when I was 7 years old to have a school librarian and a teacher who said, you know, you could send your poems out to magazines. I was 7 and I said, how? How do I do that? And they explained to me what a self-addressed stamped envelope was. And my mother worried sometime later when she noticed I was getting a lot of mail that appeared as if I had written it myself, because it was my handwriting on the envelopes addressed to me, coming back from magazines. But I already learned by the time I was 8 about patience, that if you send 10, 20 poems out, one might get accepted if you're lucky. And so by the time I was 10, I had lost any resistances about being rejected or taking a risk or worrying if someone doesn't like your work. Well, that's okay. Then maybe you work on it further. Maybe you send it somewhere else. So I feel I was given a sort of writer's code of behavior from the people I happened to meet when I was in school. I've seen teachers here at the Blake School encouraging the student voices. If you just read all the poems in the hallway, you'll feel the presence of voice here. I've seen teachers so interested here in what their students think. And I think that's one thing that people worry about around the country. If we become a nation of standardized testing only, what happens to our thinking? What happens to the connections, the creative connections, the imaginative possibilities of education? I haven't felt any concern about that at the Blake School because I see so many wonderful connections being made here. Well, I wanted to read to you, since it's morning, one of my favorite poems in the world by William Stafford, who was also Robert Bly's favorite poet in the United States. The poem is called Any Morning. I wanted to read it since it's morning and you were very generous to come to breakfast this early. William Stafford will be celebrating the centennial of his birth next year. And he died when he was 79 and was truly a great American voice, great world voice. Any morning. He was an early morning writer every day. just lying on the couch and being happy, only humming a little, the quiet sound in the head. Trouble is busy elsewhere at the moment. It has so much to do in the world. People who might judge are mostly asleep. They can't monitor you all the time, and sometimes they forget. When dawn flows over the hedge, you can get up and act busy. Little corners like this, pieces of heaven left lying around, can be picked up and saved. People won't even see that you have them. They are so light and easy to hide. Later in the day, you can act like the others. You can shake your head. You can frown. I love the poem's reminder that you don't have to have creative, meandering mental time all the whole livelong day. Just give yourself a little bit of it every day to keep your spirit restored, to keep yourself nourished. One thing I often say to teachers is when they're saying, well, you know, our curriculum is so busy, we don't really spend much time with poetry, I say, but you can sneak it in. Poems are so short. You could sneak one in. Nobody will even know. But the students will know. They'll carry it with them wherever they go. They'll have it as a gift in their hearts and their minds. They'll think of that shape of an expression, that you could say something in that little of a form, and it's meaningful, it matters. I often think about Emily Dickinson's poems, how short they were and how profound they are. Or I've been talking about William Blake this week, being at the Blake School, because I loved William Blake as a child, and his poems, especially in Songs of Innocence, were often short. And they often reminded us that you could see something huge, see the world in a grain of sand, see infinity in the palm of your hand, something big and something small. So I'll read a few quick, very small poems of mine. One remembered a song that our father, who was a Palestinian immigrant refugee, who came to the United States as a college student, who remembered a time in Jerusalem, which he always talked about all his life, when Jewish and Arab and Greek and Armenian and Christian and Muslim and Jewish, everybody mixed together and mingled. He remembered that time very fondly. He wrote about it in his own essays. But when he came to the United States, he didn't know a lot of American songs, but he liked this one. What kind of fool am I? He sang with abandon, combing his black, black hair. Each morning in the shower, first in Arabic, rivery ripples of song, carrying him back to his first beloved land. Then in English, where his repertoire was short. No kind at all, we'd shout, throwing ourselves into the brisk arc of his cologne for a morning kiss. But he gave us freedom to be fools if we needed to, which we certainly would later, which we all do now and then. Perhaps a father's greatest gift, that blessing. Some years ago, my son and father and I went and visited the village of Nevi Shalom in Hebrew, or Wahat al-Salam in Arabic, oasis of peace. Has anyone here ever been there? It's an incredible model village that was actually started by a Christian brother in the hills in Israel, and it's a half and half village, very democratic, half Arab, half Jewish. All of the chores and all of the glories and pleasures are shared equally in this village. And we visited the school, and afterwards our son, who was young at the time, said, you know, I don't understand what the problem is in this country, because to me everybody looks the same. I can't even tell anyone apart. And they all seem to be getting along beautifully in the school. And that was something my father often would say, if only countries could learn to behave together the way school communities learn to behave, where the students don't all match exactly, they don't all have exact home experiences that are identical, but there is a camaraderie, a school spirit, a gracious spirit that develops. Right now, oddly, this poem of mine is tacked to telephone poles in Jerusalem in 3 languages. Arabic, Hebrew, and English. It was tacked up there by an NPR correspondent I have never met. She wrote to me to get my permission. I thought this was unique. I said, feel free. Anybody who wants to tack my poems to telephone poles in any city, go right ahead. So this poem has a quote from the great Swedish poet Tommy Olofsson at the top, where he said in one of his poems, "Let's be the same wound if we must bleed. Let's fight side by side, even if the enemy is ourselves. I am yours, you are mine." Jerusalem. And the quote in the poem from a child's poem was being written that day we visited the school. Jerusalem. I'm not interested in who suffered the most. I'm interested in people getting over it. Once, when my father was a boy, a stone hit him on the head. Hair would never grow there. Our fingers found the tender spot and its riddle. The boy who has fallen stands up. A bucket of pears in his mother's doorway welcomes him home. The pears are not crying. Later, his friend who threw the stone says he was aiming at a bird, and my father starts growing wings. Each carries a tender spot, something our lives forgot to give us. A man builds a house and says, I am native now. A woman speaks to a tree in place of her son, and olives come. A child's poem says, I don't like wars. They end up with monuments. He's painting a bird with wings wide enough to cover 2 roofs at once. Why are we so monumentally slow? Soldiers stalk a pharmacy. Big guns, little pills. If you tilt your head just slightly, it's ridiculous. There's a place in this brain where hate won't grow. I touch its riddle, wind and seeds. Something pokes us as we sleep. It's late, but everything comes next. I found early on that poetry was something that helped me think. I discovered what I had experienced. I was able to connect thoughts in a different way, and sometimes a poem could feel like a little place of rescue for thinking, because thinking is often overwhelming and there are so many things to consider, but when you focus, as you do in a poem, on a few images, it's easier to think. William Stafford used to say, we all start out being poets. Just listen to the ways toddlers speak. Listen to the metaphors that pop out of the mouths of 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds. I visited the pre-K the other day. They're still doing it. And some of us try to keep up that habit, Stafford said, by continuing to play with language, by continuing to let language come to us, work through us, and guide us. I've never been any place in my wandering life where poetry didn't live. But certainly it can live very happily in a place like the Blake School, because here you have such a supportive atmosphere for shared experience, for student expression, for standing up and saying poems. In this very room, the middle school gave a big poetry event. I wish I had been here. I heard there were 2 young hip-hop poets who came and guided the middle school in their work. They loved this, talking about all the different elements that raised them. And sometimes with something like poetry, which is so essential to our hearts and lives, you just need a little more exposure. And I'd like to thank Blake School for exposing students to so many voices and letting me be one of them. And just before we have a little Q&A here with Woody, I'll read a newer poem that I wrote recently. I went to Finland. I was invited to go to an international poetry event in Finland. I was very excited. I didn't realize how quickly I would fall in love with just the shapes of buildings, the design elements of Helsinki. I wanted to stay there. Of course, it was August when I was there, and they kept saying, but if you were here in January, you would feel different. Anyway, the American Embassy asked me if I minded if they invited the First Lady to have a poetry lunch with us. I was shocked. I said, feel free, invite anyone. And so they said, well, why don't you invite 8 of your favorite writers in Helsinki to join us? That was a moment I was very glad for the internet. Because if you're from South Texas and you're suddenly asked to name your 8 favorite writers in Helsinki, you could have a panic attack. But I found 8, and they all came because they were told that they were going to be having lunch with the First Lady. So this was very exciting, you know, that I was able to name 8 people, and here they are the next few days. So we're having lunch, and the First Lady of Finland, Jenny Haugi, told us that she, Jenny Haugi, to pronounce it correctly, that she was a poet when she was young, and she was also the director of all the sports programs for teenagers in Finland. And I said, this is great. I love it when poetry and sports and poetry and science and poetry and math, when things are put together and mixed. And she said, yes, and I found that, you know, sports gave me so many metaphors, and I always felt that writing poems helped clarify my mind, and I would always keep notebooks and all the things, you know, that poets talk about. And then, so some of the writers said, and are you writing now? And she said, well, you know, when you're the First Lady, you have many obligations, so I haven't been writing that much, and I really miss it. And one of the happy things I can report is that after having lunch with these beautiful 8 writers from her own city, she wrote to me that she started writing again, that she got a new notebook, that she began working on poems again, and I felt that was just, there it was, the exposure to 8 people who were encouraging her to write again, who saw her as a writer as much as they saw her as the wife of the president. She did, I must say, invite me to come over and have a tour of the palace the next day, and where all of these beautiful historical things of Finland are housed. And then I found myself eating salmon sandwiches with the president of Finland, talking about poetry, and I thought, you know, things happen in life that you could never have believed, because she didn't tell me her husband was going to join us for lunch. So I thought, this is just unreal. And we were talking about his experience with writing, and how in the hardest time in his own life, when his first wife had been killed, that it was writing essays about other people's bravery, the bravery of his neighbors, that saved him. Incredible story. I said, has your book been translated into English? And he said, no, not yet. But I thought, this is amazing to hear these stories. And you know, so writing will take us many places we could never imagine. And trust me, it's the first time I've ever eaten with a president and suggested a translator to him. Okay, so here's a poem I wrote during my stay, week-long, in Helsinki. And I was very conscious of immigrants there. I always notice Arab immigrants, any city I visit, where I saw the Marhaba restaurant here, and I wished I could go there. But this is called Arabs in Finland. Their language rolls out, soft carpet in front of them. Strolling slowly beneath trees, men in white shirts, belts, baggy trousers. What they left to be here, in the cold country, where winter lasts forever, haunts them in the dark. Golden hue of souk in sunlight, gentle calling through streets that said, brother, sit with me a minute on the small stool with the steaming glass of tea. Sit with me. We belong together. Thank you. So, Woody, and again, my thanks to Blake School for hosting me here. So,
I'm sure there's
thanks.
Any questions for Naomi? I've got a pile of them, but
Any questions? Any
I've been
answers?
reading her stuff for a couple of days, but any.
Yes.
I'm just curious, I don't have the creative ability to write things, but when you start out in your career, where does your income come from?
Well, that's a great question. My income came from working in restaurants, babysitting, working in different local places when I was a teenager. But since I started writing so early, I knew that it was something I could do no matter what job I had. And the biggest surprise in my life was that I was able to have an income from visiting schools. And I started visiting schools straight out of college, working for the Texas Commission on the Arts in a visiting writers program. And I worked for years in all kinds of schools in Texas, urban, rural, poor, wealthy, private, public, every single kind of school. So for writers who choose to work in education, sometimes it could be through educational sources. But in San Antonio, we have many poets who are very active locally, who are doctors, engineers, lawyers. We have a policeman, poet. We have all kinds of backgrounds of poets. So, you know, one thing nice about it is it could be something that you do no matter what else you do. Yeah, you could not live off of the residual funds from your poetry books, or you would be extremely thin. Yes. I did not, no. I write in many forms, and yes, I didn't go to a writing program, no. I went to a university in Texas. That my major was world religions, and also I studied English, you know, literature, but especially contemporary American literature and contemporary world literature, but I did not go to a writing program, and I did not get a master's degree or any further graduate work. So the writing itself was, I was always experimenting and going to as many poetry readings as I could, and listening to writers talk and reading as widely as I could. Really, the library in my school and in my community was always my place of study. You know, just self-taught, I guess. Yes, Alan? Well, what is it that distinguishes poetry from prose is the question. William Stafford used to say, if it looks like a poem on the page, and I send it to an editor and call it a poem, and they accept it as a poem, I guess it's a poem. But you're very right that in a lot of the contemporary vernacular poetry that doesn't have what some people might identify as a more official poetic style, say like a sonnet or a villanelle or a haiku, some identifiable style where it's written in more of an open form, some people might say, well, that sort of sounds like prose. And it does. I mean, there are very close connections. I love the prose poem, which Robert Bly has been a huge advocate of and encourager of. But, you know, visually, a poem is usually more vertical and has very intentional line breaks and stanza breaks. And so I think for students to look at poems, to feel that shaping of lines, that selection of words. Yes? Which of my books would I recommend? Well, maybe the book Words Under the Words that has my grandmother on the cover. Maybe that one I would recommend, just because it's kind of thick. So if you don't like some of the poems, you might like another one. and I urge students to pick up poetry anthologies. I tell them, poets don't like every poem that's ever been written. Just like, you know, if you love sports, it doesn't mean you love all sports equally. You probably have a favorite sport. Same with food, same with anything. So pick up a poetry anthology and read through it. Read 100 poems, and you can do that quickly. And then pick out which voices really grabbed you. And then go find more poems by those voices. That's how I first found Robert Bly's voice, was through an anthology. I thought, I love this voice. Who is this person? And immediately was carried, you know, to Minnesota, to Rain, by falling in love with his books. So just, you know, read poems and then select the voices you would like to read more of. Yes?
When you go in the classroom, how do you challenge the students? Is it a topic?
Well, that's a great question. How do you challenge students? Well, often I try to challenge them with the idea of developing a habit of writing. And I show them, in the elementary school, I was showing them my toolkit, my pencil sharpener, and my notebook. And I said, this is the same toolkit I had when I was 7 and 9 and 18. And I loved it because I could pay for it all with $1. And it's a very portable toolkit. And even with all the technology in the world these days, I still prefer this most basic toolkit. But if you get in this daily habit of writing, inviting language to come through you, just writing 3 sentences a day, minimum, I tell students. You know, if you can write down 3 details you noticed today, 3 things you overheard, 3 interesting facts you learned in school, 3 questions you're carrying with you. And then don't read, you know, what you're writing for maybe a month. Well, at the end of a month, you'll have 90 lines, 90 details that you might otherwise have forgotten. That's a lot of text. It's a lot of material, and any one of those lines might carry you into an interesting piece of writing. But until you get in this habit of sort of collecting and gathering what's given to you, how much you have around you, you won't know how much you have. So I try to urge them, consider that habit. Many students already keep notebooks, and ones who don't will sometimes be a little bit resistant. Sometimes I run into them later and they say, that was absolutely right. I started keeping a notebook and I was shocked how many little things I could notice every day. Sometimes I'll read a poem that I love and say, does anybody else like this poem? Talk about it a little bit. Try to have a bit more of an immediate and intimate relationship with a poem than sometimes the questions in textbooks might give us. Yes?
Two questions. One, how do you mind your notebook, since they must be voluminous? And two, some age kids after a certain point lose the fluency or the ability. How do you keep that going?
Right. Well, continuing, how do you mind your notebooks? My notebooks are very disreputable. They're stacked everywhere. They're in boxes. They're in picnic baskets. They're all messed up. They're not very well-minded. But I do open them. I open different ones. Oh, mind them. Oh, mind them, how I mind them. Well, I'll open them up different times when I'm looking for something, and I'll circle things. I highlight areas, something that seems interesting to me later, something I had forgotten. Right now I'm working on a book and I'm mining some notebooks to kind of pull out some things that I've never used in anything I've written, and I think, could this be in this story? What about this quote, this detail? Could I use it? So at different times you go into your notebooks with different intentions or different needs. And you're right, students, their needs, their desires change as they get older, and trying to continue to expose them to voices that might be meaningful to them at different ages. For example, William Stafford, I think, is much more moving to a high school student than an elementary student, versus, they're cheering about poets they're reading who are funny poets, or mysterious poets. So different poems for different ages, presenting voices you think might be appropriate, always giving books as gifts to kids. I heard something wonderful years ago. A farmer showed up at a weekend workshop I was doing in Oklahoma. And he came in and he said, I'm not here to write with the rest of you. I'd like to sit over in the corner. He's wearing overalls, actually, so he's easily identifiable. He's come from the farm. I'd like to sit over in the corner, and I'd just like to listen to you all when you read what you write during the weekend. This seemed a little strange, and I said, well, why? Why are you doing this? And he said, well, when I was a child, our grandfather lived with us, and he used to wake us up every day by reading poems in a resonant hallway. We would hear this voice reading poems as a wake-up call. And I have been hungry for the voices of poetry all my life since he died. And so people were very moved by this, and every time anyone would stand up to read their poem, they would turn to this man sitting in the corner who was just having a great weekend, drinking coffee and sitting in the corner and waiting for them to read to him. And when I went home to Texas, I thought, our son was about 16 at the time, and I'd had to give up reading him bedtime stories about 3 years before. I thought, I'm going to adopt this habit. A sleeping teenager is not very resistant. So I started, I would go to his bedside, and I would read 3 poems every morning, and he loved it. He absolutely loved it. I often read Robert Bly, I read Frank O'Hara, I read Chinese poems. It's interesting to select poems also that would be good wake-up call poems. And he never said, stop doing that. He would just say, like at breakfast, something like, did Frank O'Hara really write that, or did you make that up? And I'd say, no, it's a real poem. I'll tell you the poem. And I felt as if I was pouring poetry into his brain as his wake-up in the mornings. There are all kinds of ways that we can share poems with one another. So Poetry Month is now April, and if you are inspired to copy down a poem and stick it under your neighbor's windshield wiper, I'd suggest you do it. Yes? Uh-huh. Well, I think men need poems as much as women do, and I really think we all do. But that's an interesting comment. So thank you, men, for coming out. I really do appreciate that. Because so many great poets in our world have been men. It's not as if young boy writers don't have any great examples. They do. And I don't know, just hearing one another read can often be a very contributory factor to voices of young males. But I don't know, I've loved as many male poets as women poets. And you know, sometimes people talk about, well, in anthologies, they were always male heavy, more men in anthologies. And I guess that's true. When I was growing up, anthologies were very American and British, and now and then a Bengali poet or a Mexican poet would sneak in there, but not as much as now. Now there's much more of an eclectic world sense of world literature. So, you know, things change, there are trends, but I guess I don't have anything very wise to say about the differences of gender. I do think that language and expression is something that, you know, no matter what age we are, no matter what background we have, you know, we need it. We yearn for it. We're lonely for it. We want it. And so I wish I had something smarter to say about that. Did the person next to you have a question? Oh. Yes. Right. Right. More important than ever. Right. Right. We're willing to skim lots of headlines and see all these things in a kind of superficial, shallow way. And I think we need to slow down more than we ever did. And I think poetry is something that slows you down, at least for a moment. We need that focus. It helps you focus on something, go below the surface. And I do think something like Writer's Almanac, Garrison Keillor has done a tremendous service in this country. Wherever I go, people will say, I love those poems. I hear a poem a day. And people are always making testimonials about Writer's Almanac. It's such a beautiful thing. And, you know, to be driving along, many times people will say, I pulled over to hear the rest of the poem. I liked it so much, I stopped. And I think that's what a poem wants to do. It wants us to stop and say, hey, this was beautiful. Pay attention, this was happening. We were here. You know, just to take note in a very precious kind of way. So the fact that he's done that has been a huge gift in our country. So probably should we, did you want to ask one question?
I have a question.
One question.
You have wandered a lot, and you've
Yes.
spent a lot of time in the Middle East with a Palestinian fatherland. Tell a little bit about the experiences you've had with Middle Eastern women. You being, as I would say, an American, liberated in the fact that you can travel and do a lot on your own.
Yes.
You have a lot of your own experiences, and then some of these experiences with the Middle Eastern women, and just...
Well, I have had chances to meet many young girls and women in the Middle East, and I was related to quite a few of women there too, and still am. But one thing interesting is I think many people imagine that Middle Eastern women are more oppressed and sheltered than they really are, and they're often asking me to speak up for their intelligence and also their sophistication, that they know a lot more than people think they know. Women in Saudi Arabia, where I've worked multiple times, I find Saudi Arabia, you know, really fascinating because there's so much that still you want to see happen there. The women say, does anyone know how well read we are? And then they'll start talking about writers from so many different countries, and you know, maybe they don't look, you know, in their clothing that they're wearing out in the street the way we would prefer them to get to look. Maybe they can't get in the car and drive, but they still have, you know, a body of knowledge that is very wide. Actually, among my two grandmothers, my oppressed grandmother was my German Lutheran grandmother. My Palestinian Muslim grandmother was a wild card who spoke to everyone. Although she was a refugee, she had no bitterness in her soul. I had an Israeli professor from Hebrew University come to me after her death and say, your grandmother changed my life. I fell in love with her. I'm an anthropologist. I went to that village to study Arab people. But when you fall in love with someone, it's better than just studying them. And she changed my life. And I said, that's the greatest gift you could ever have given me. And I'm sure she loved you too. He said, she did. And I thought, you know, that is beautiful. Everybody thinks this woman, you know, never went anywhere. Here, this man from a university says she changed his life. So my German Lutheran grandmother from St. Louis was very shy to speak her opinions. She always deferred to men. She always stood back in a conversation, and the most frequent thing I remember her saying was, "Oh, never mind." Like if she had a differing opinion and got pressed back by my grandfather, she would say, "Oh, never mind." And I thought early on, I want her to talk more. Speak up, Grandma. And so that's kind of interesting to kids sometimes. Because I have a poem called Voices, where it talks about the voices of women being pushed back into their throats. And some of the students have imagined that's about my Arab grandmother. I say, no, that's about my St. Louis grandmother. But women in the Middle East are, if they're educated, if they're given opportunity, they're just as wonderful as women anywhere. And I just hope that every country diminishes in its possibilities of oppression of any kind as we go along. So I'll close just with a tiny little thing. I often tell students, you don't have to make up all your poems, just listen better. Just write down things you heard during the day, something weird someone said in the lunchroom. So here's one, I would read them as an example. And it was said to be by my postal clerk. And I wrote it down immediately on the back of a package outside the post office the minute after he said it. Friendly postal clerk, Saturday morning. So what do poets do on weekends, huh? I guess nothing much, right? I guess every day is a weekend to you. Thank you.